Hey, hello, and welcome back to the Darkness Underneath podcast. This is episode 2 of Roy Demeo and Murder Machine, titled Building a Nightmare. So, in 1972, Roy Demeo purchased Phil's Lounge and renamed it Gemini Lounge. Over the next 11 years, it would become one of the worst crime scenes in New York City history after 9/11. There at the Gemini Lounge, and in the apartment next door, a large number of people would go missing, murdered in a methodical and brutal fashion, their bodies dismembered and transported to the Fountain Avenue dump, where they'd never be seen again. This was done by a group of serial killers, and the most feared assassins in New York City, so feared that even John Gotti and Sammy the Bull didn't want anything to do with them. And this series is about how it happened. Where I last left you, Roy Demeo murdered Rothenberg back in 1973 after a year of harassing him, on Nino's orders because they believed he was talking to a prosecutor, which he was. That's where we're going to continue now. Now, let's go back in time together. Back to the 1970s. It's the 1970s. Crime had risen enormously since when Roy was growing up in the 50s. Dilapidated buildings stretched across Bronx wastelands. Decayed, stripped cars dirtied Brooklyn landscapes. Graffiti was everywhere. The city was in neglect. Heroin, coke, acid, and quaaludes were popular. Gang violence was growing. Up in Harlem, African-American drug lord Nicky Barnes and the council were in charge of heroin trafficking, and they worked to ship drugs in with the Lucchese and Colombo crime families. In Hell's Kitchen, Manhattan, a violent Irish gang known as the Westies ruled. They were led by Mickey Spillane. They kept the mafia at bay, for now. In 1970, the Italian-American Civil Rights League was formed. Its stated goal was to fight discrimination against Italian Americans and stereotypes associating Italian Americans with the mafia. It managed to get the terms La Cosa Nostra and Mafia removed from the Godfather script. In reality, it was a public relations campaign started by the Colombo crime family to get the FBI off their back. In 1972, the World Trade Center would be built amongst a lot of controversy. Over 100 tenants had to be evicted, as well as over 300 businesses. Strip clubs, sex shops, pornographic theaters, swingers sex clubs, and live sex shows sprung up all over New York City at the time, especially around Times Square. Prostitution also flourished, with many of the prostitutes being between the ages of 14 and 20. The Mafia's 5 families had reached its zenith since after the old bootlegging days. It had infiltrated industries all over New York City, like a venomous spider laying a web in many different directions. Some of the lucrative areas that the Mafia had infiltrated included construction, garments, smuggling, gambling, prostitution, union fixing, loan sharking, auto theft, drugs, and there was a growing influence in pornography, though it's important to remember that back then, New York City outlawed the kind of pornography that you see today, and only some families allowed drug dealing among their members. Carlos Gambino still forbid it. Through most of 1973, life was going great for Roy. He had as much money as you could want and lived in a house he built for himself. Someday he would live in an even bigger house. And as terrifying as Roy could be to others, that wasn't the image Roy put on for his neighbors. He was usually helpful and pleasant outside of work. He was also cheerful. His kids loved him. He would always be on time for birthdays and any other important date that they had. His son looked up to him. Roy was also an avid reader and would give his son books when he was done with them. One year in the future, when his son was 11, Roy would give him his Bible, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. And as for his ambitions, Roy had his sights on becoming a made man as much as ever. Although Roy wasn't Sicilian, he was Neapolitan, full-blooded Italian, and so that made him eligible to become a made man if he met the right requirements. And so what are the requirements? you need to be sponsored by at least one made man. Then there are two major other requirements. The first one is you need to be a really good earner. Check. Even when he'd been in his mid-20s, Roy had never been impressed with how much those Lucchese chumps running the Brooklyn dumps had been making. Roy was a cash cow now. If you squeezed his udder, he'd give you more Benjamins than anybody who had ever worked for Nino before. Roy's biggest moneymaker was his auto theft ring. You see, back in the early 70s, a $10,000 car was worth more than $20,000 in parts. And with these guys working for him now, car surgeons, basically. Broadway Freddie, Denomi, and now this kid Patty Testa that Chris had introduced him to, his auto theft ring was growing to become one of the biggest in the city, maybe the biggest in the country someday. His stolen car operation connected all the way to Kuwait. He was selling fancy cars there for a lower price, but making an exorbitant amount because he didn't pay anything at all for them. They were stolen. By the end of 1972, Roy had been a Gambino Mafia associate for years, and proved his potential multiple times over, out-earning a lot of higher-ups. And when I say business was thriving, I mean both illegal and legal business. Although some of his buddies helped him hide tax expenses by adding his name to their business, Roy remained terrified of the IRS, a government entity he probably feared more than any other at this point. Roy needed to figure out a way to hide the money he was earning from racketeering and other illegal pursuits if he wanted to avoid police attention. And besides, Roy hated taxes. He'd hide as much of his money as he could from the government, so long as the risk didn't outweigh the benefit. He once went to a local bowling alley in the Flatlands. He'd played there growing up. He was there to ask a guy he knew from middle school, who was now an IRS agent, how they proved that someone spent more than they reported when doing net worth cases. One question Roy said was, like, how would you make a case against a guy who said he made his money off gambling? That old acquaintance became suspicious, causing Roy to backtrack and then leave in a huff. Later, at acquaintance's funeral, he abruptly forgot his respects to the dead man after spotting this IRS agent and turned to the other mourners and said with contempt, "Stool pigeons are in the room," before leaving. Roy found one way to hide his money and fleece the system by joining the Borough Brooklyn Credit Union. It only took a few months for him to talk his way onto the board of directors, and he began talking to his colleagues about how they could earn more by laundering money for drug dealers. Pretty soon they were looking the other way when he wanted loans. Other businesses he began investing through his corruption included 2 restaurants, a dentist's office, an abortion clinic, and a flea market. He also owned a car dealership. Now, had Roy known that his meddling in the Brooklyn Credit Union had led to one of the more honest members telling the FBI, which led to him getting his name put into a folder for the first time, he would have probably shit himself and regretted joining the Brooklyn Credit Union at all. Now, another thing that the Mafia would ask of you if you want to be a made man is to kill somebody. No problem there. Roy wouldn't hesitate. As far as Roy was concerned, he'd made his bones by killing that fucking weasel Rothenberg. He'd whack that guy like an artist. So yeah, his dreams were coming true. Maybe Roy'd even be running the Gambinos someday, and he'd make sure everybody knew to be afraid of him if they crossed him. Just like that Machiavelli said in his book, The Prince. If you gotta choose between being loved, but double-crossed more often, or feared, but nobody fucks with you, you choose fear. That should be the motto every boy is taught. However, it didn't matter. Not only were the books not open, Gambino hardly knew who he was yet. He wasn't important enough. So if he wanted to impress the old man Gambino, he had to impress Nino at this point. And he had impressed Nino with Rothenberg, and he was about to impress Nino again in 73, though he'd also screw up, but more about that in the future. Phil's Lounge came up short with the $6,000 it needed to avoid shutting down. Demeo paid the money, stepping in, and became the secret owner, though on paper it was owned by one of the Doherty brothers. The lounge was renamed Gemini Lounge, after an astronomical sign, because they thought it sounded better. From the period between 1972 and through early 1974, The Gemini Lounge was just Roy's headquarters. Nobody was probably hanging corpses upside down in the creepy-looking apartment just next door to the bar area. At least not yet. So it was built in 1954, which you can see if you're looking at the screen. That meant that Roy was probably the second through the fourth owner, since Phil's Lounge was there by the 60s. And it's about half a mile from a police precinct and a fire station. The lounge's patrons were usually locals, or at least worked in the area, blue-collar guys, during the day. Maybe a firefighter, cop, postal worker, or delivery truck guy. That's, of course, unless you're some kind of criminal. You were also probably of Italian or Irish descent if you were hanging out at that bar. And if you weren't Irish or Italian, you might be an Ashkenazi Jewish guy. Sometimes blacks would come there, not very many. Racial problems, although hardly ideal in New York City today, were even worse back then, and they might not have felt as welcome. The Gemini Lounge wasn't a particularly distinguishable place, as if you're watching with the visuals, you can probably see. If you've ever been to Brooklyn, it was about as pablum as any local Brooklyn bar can be, other than being a little bit bleak looking. And I say that with a bit of bias, because I know the tragedies that happen there. When you'd enter the Gemini Lounge, it'd be dark. Albert, Roy's son, said it was always so dim inside you had to really try to make out who's who. That made doing business like betting, loan sharking, or perhaps even more unsavory matters a little bit more private when it wasn't too busy. It wasn't so dark, though, that Roy, getting more and more keen in his observational skills, couldn't tell the cops from the wise guys when they both sauntered in wearing dress clothes. Roy always said that if you wanted to tell the difference between a cop and a wise guy, look at their shoes. Cops wore identical, cheap, black ones. Wise guys wore more fashionable leather shoes, wanting to show them off. They were more ostentatious. And of course, they had more money to be. And if they were young wise guys, they might have a pair of expensive Nikes planted on their feet. Above the bar, there'd be an old-fashioned box television set playing something in dull colors for the patrons. Probably a game, especially the Mets. Brooklyners love their Mets. Now off against the wall, you had your typical jukebox and pinball machine. There were also pool tables. The bartender was usually an Irish guy named Jackie. He was the guy who ran the place for Roy. He was large and bulky, with pink features and muscles built like rocks. A retired firefighter, Al Demeo, Roy's son, remembers Jackie being gregarious and sociable. Of course, who'd be stupid enough to be mean to Albert Demeo? Behind the bar, off to the side, there was a door, and that led to a storage room where Roy kept his safe. And in that safe, he kept extra weapons, guns, money for loan sharking, and other things that were valuable. It's bigger in there than it might appear on the outside to most people. There were roughly 10 bar stools and tables, and it had an elevated floor. There was also a stage for local bands and enough space for several couples to dance the hustle. Roy was sitting in the back against the wall. It was a good spot for him. It was harder to notice who might be doing business with him. It made it impossible to sneak up on him. It was also easier for him to see you before you saw him, so he could observe your details. Of course, sitting at an elevated table also has its psychological advantages, especially when you have admiring minions all around you. Those admiring minions, his new crew, they were his army, and he was planning on making them deadly. Though to onlookers at the time, they might have looked about 15. Dominic Montiglio, Nino Gadgi's nephew. Dominic's responsibility was to take money from Roy and give it to Nino. He was kind of like a delivery guy at the time. He noticed Roy's young crew seated around him and told Nino, "Roy's hanging out with kids." That's right, he was, but not really children. Teens to early 20s. If you want to make a man into what you want him to be, you don't start when he already has an identity. You reach him when he's still trying to figure out who he is. But Roy wanted a certain type of kid, and he didn't want anybody tainted by firm moral views. He had a recipe. That recipe for his new crew was bitter, morally flexible, looking to prove themselves, looking to be part of something bigger, hard, angry at society, criminal, willing to obey him, and directionless. He preferred that they had brains too. Joey and Anthony weren't the smartest, but they were capable of doing the job. Now, Roy Demeo would add purpose, and he'd impress them. He'd be like a sculptor, and he'd mold them to something stronger. He'd make them more self-assured. Only a fucking idiot tears down their followers. A real leader makes them more confident, makes them stronger, but he reminds them who the fuck gave them that confidence. And if you want to be in his crew, don't go looking to get the fuck out. Roy Mepha-fucking-Stopheles Demeo was usually generous, but he wasn't forgiving. In the shadows, his crew would use gestures with secret meanings to communicate when somebody was around. Maybe Dominic, Nino's fucking errand boy. Maybe a cop. Perhaps a potential client. Maybe just some patron who needed to mind their own fucking business. There were 4 particularly deadly members of the Demeo crew. They would become Roy's core acolytes of murder. Chris Rosenberg, Joey Testa, Anthony Center, and Henry Borelli. Henry Borelli only came in occasionally, and you'll hear more about him in the future. Joey and Anthony Center were also known as the Gemini twins. However, they were neither twins or even real brothers. Patty Testa was the only member of the Demeo crew that was Joey's actual brother, and as far as what's known, Patty mostly focused on the car theft operations and only provided muscle if they needed it. Now, the Gemini twins in 73 would have been 18. Joey, he kind of looked like a Italian singer. He was more traditionally handsome. He oftentimes had this really fake grin. Women found it charming. His grin was really wide and oftentimes didn't match his cold eyes. To me, it looks more like a date rapist grin, but whatever. And he'd oftentimes flash that smile when he wanted to seriously hurt somebody. He was the more dominating personality between the 2 twins. Anthony was more of the follower. You'd oftentimes find Joey complaining about his lungs because recently he had been stabbed in the lung and collapsed a lung by this Puerto Rican guy while he had been knife fighting him. Joey loved knives. He also had a background as a butcher like Roy, which would come in useful. So he'd complain about his lung and clutch his chest. Oh, my lungs! But then he'd flick his 4th cigarette for the day, or the 5th cigarette. He was a chain smoker, constantly. And if you try to tell him anything, he'd ignore you and just keep smoking while complaining about his lungs. Anthony, who was always looking to be like Joey, they drove the same car. Oftentimes, Anthony would finish his sentence. He'd oftentimes complain about his luck or his bad back. And they were both kind of stereotypical Italian mob guys. Their image was all centered around being in the mafia. Sometimes Joey kind of reminds me of the guy in American Psycho. Like he completely lacks an identity underneath this, and he's trying to live up to a stereotype. Now, Chris had so many psychological problems that he badly needed a psychologist. You could say that about Demeo, too. And it would be very easy to feel bad for him until you remember what a fucking prick he was. Some sources say that Chris had worked for Demeo the longest, but he actually worked for Demeo the second longest. And you can't trust everything that Wikipedia says. It oftentimes doesn't cite their sources and is incorrect. Now, Chris often kept his hair long back in those days. Sometimes he had a mustache. If he was going around selling Quaaludes or Coke, he'd graduated from just marijuana. He'd often wear bell-bottoms and long billowing shirts, looking like a hippie more than a drug dealer. And he'd often pick up chicks in popular areas like the Village. Now, if he was at the Gemini, he'd oftentimes wear a black leather coat and expensive Levi's, like Roy. You would have probably considered him harmless. And in a physical fight, he wasn't a match for a lot of guys. He was only 5'5" and he was slender. After 72, Chris was oftentimes introducing himself as Chris Demeo. He started to see Roy as a kind of dad figure, and Roy kind of saw him as a son figure too. Roy loved Chris. His real name, of course, was Harvey Rosenberg, for those familiar with this case, but Chris hated that name. He hated the name Harvey because he felt like it sounded like a fucking dweeb. a pussy, not a tough guy like him. The name Chris gave him confidence, and Chris needed confidence. People presumed that because he was only 5'5", he was a wimp, and that he was no threat to them, and he really cared about being strong and tough. This guy had an ultra-Napoleonic complex. You see, Napoleon was an inch taller than him, and average for his day. Now, the name Rosenberg, which I kind of like, he hated his last name because he hated being Jewish, and he felt like it was too Jewish. He wanted to be Italian like his friends. I have a feeling that this guy was picked on a lot like Roy as a kid. That's one of the reasons why they connected, partially because he was small, and partially because he was Jewish, in an Italian neighborhood. But he considered the Italians tough, and he considered Roy the paragon of what he wanted to be. So yeah, Chris considered himself more Italian than Jewish. And when he went to Hebrew camp, while being raised by his dad, who wasn't that observant, he'd start picking on the other Jewish kids, until they finally kicked him out. And at this point, Roy was more of a dad figure. He was estranged from his parents. He was smart, sociable, and a go-getter. By his 20s, he was living in an upscale apartment in Flatlands and paying kids to clean his Porsche and Corvette, and had as much money as he could want. His two best friends, although I hardly consider them friends, were Joey Testa and Anthony Center, and I'll get into their background more in the future. Now, at the end of 1973 through 1974, the crew had their first serious problem. Chris met this guy, Andrea Katz, whose parents that he worked for owned a foreign car service. And it began with Andrea Katz buying stolen car parts from Chris, and they and the Gemini twins forged a temporary friendship. Now let's go there. At 23 years old, Katz was extremely proud of himself. He was an accomplished drug dealer and car thief, after all, and he was a damn good car thief. Even the cops said so. You'd be at a loss to find anything that Katz wasn't proud about himself. He was perhaps most proud when it came to the ladies. They cannot resist my gypsy features and my bad boy mentality. As fate was cruel enough to have it, one day this emotionally dysfunctional hothead met another emotionally unstable hothead, Chris Rosenberg, and Chris introduced Katz to another pair of thugs, the Gemini twins, and they began dealing drugs and stealing and tagging cars together. Soon, much of those drugs they were dealing was also finding its way up their noses when they began snorting coke at Katz's place and sharing stories of their crimes. It was fun while it lasted, but it was a friendship that was doomed. These were just not a group of guys that meshed well, at least Katz and Chris. When Chris tagged a stolen van that Katz obtained, Katz sold that van to a friend. The cops then arrested that friend because it was poorly tagged, who then led them back to Katz. Katz was furious. Chris did a lousy job retagging that van. The VIN plate was an obvious phony. After Katz was released from jail, the details aren't specifically known, but they probably went something like this. Chris, you need to get over here. We've got to talk. You did a terrible job. I got arrested for it. The authorities told me that if I talked about our stolen car ring, it would help my case. What is known is that when Chris learned that Andre was out on bail, he and Patty Testa and Joey came by the auto shop, and the following exchange occurred. You better think about what you're going to do or say, or else you're going to get hurt, Chris said, getting right to the point. Fuck you! Get the fuck out of my shop! I'm just saying. Watch yourself. Fuck you! I'll take care of you! Chris and the Testas left that day, but of course that was only the beginning. I'll deal with it myself, and I'm going to testify against Chris someday, Katz promised his brother. Chris was never going to leave Katz alone now, and neither were the Gemini twins. If Katz talked to the prosecutor, they could trace the stolen car ring back to them and Demeo. They needed to make sure this guy didn't talk. Plus, Katz had talked a lot of trash. Chris was obviously fuming. He'll take care of me? Does he think I'm some kind of Harvey? Does he think I'm not gonna do anything about it? Like my pushover dad? Chris showed up at a horse stable next day where Katz owned a horse and reminded him to keep quiet. Katz, who had as much pride as Chris and wasn't about to be bullied, told him, "The problem's your fault!" Chris lost his temper and punched Katz before running away. Katz was going to have to see reason somehow. A few days later, Katz was pulled out of his car by the Gemini twins and savagely pistol-whipped and blackjacked, which means beaten with a baton or some other kind of blunt instrument. Katz was so savagely beaten that his face, which as you recall he took a lot of pride in, was black and purple. His ear was also almost severed. He was so unrecognizable, his dad and brother wouldn't let his mom see him in the hospital. From now on, Katz was going to be careful wherever he went. He wasn't going anywhere by himself. And, on top of that, he would always be armed. He also decided he was going to do a lot more than testify against that scumbag Rosenberg. No, Katz decided he's going to kill Chris for this.